Comrades, welcome to this session, very interesting session. I'm sure you agree, the rise of fascism in Germany. Last week we looked at Italy with David Broder, and today Kevin will be looking at Germany. This is the first part of a two sessions that are looking at fascism in Germany. The second one will be dealing with actually the Nazism itself, but this time I think we're concentrating on how it came to Nazism and fascism in Germany, which is very interesting, as I'm sure you can tell from my lovely accent. I am German, from Germany, and the way we've been taught this is, you know, there's a bit of hoo-ha going on in the Weimar Republic. You learn nothing about the German Revolution of 1918. So there's the instability, Weimar Republic, and then this madman Adolf Hitler comes along, and because of him, fascism happens, basically. I think this kind of viewpoint is perhaps most stupidly shown in this film. I can't remember what it's called, The Artist or something, which concentrates on Hitler as a unappreciated artist, and the message is, if only, you know, somebody had recognized his artistic project, his artistic talent, then perhaps we would have been spared fascism in Germany and Europe. I mean, Jesus Christ. This is to focus on, this is still a very popular idea in Germany in particular, that it was Hitler who did it. You know, had there been no Hitler, then you'd had no fascism, no Nazism, rather than trying to understand that this was a systematic reason why capitalism turned to fascism and turned to somebody like Adolf Hitler. The most critical view you get is the psychological thought experiment. You know, if you're against murder, against the murder of, you know, in fascism, would you have killed Hitler when you had the chance? You know, and you get sort of pseudo-intellectual debates around that, and that's as critical and interesting as it gets, which again totally misses the point. So I'm really glad we are doing some serious re-education program here for comrades, and I hope lots of comrades will be able to watch this video later as well, and I'm sharing it on Facebook a bit more. Enough yabbering from me. I'm very glad that Kevin is looking at this issue in more details. Usual process, he's talking for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we have questions and comments from the floor. Take it away, Kevin.
Okay, thanks very much, Tina. Before I begin, I have put a number of items up on the LLA education pages. There's both a reading list and a couple of documents. The documents are some election results from Germany in this period, and I'll refer to them in passing. There are also some selections from Leon Trotsky on Germany, and also a reading list which includes really a wide range of sources. I'd say for comrades who are coming new to this topic, I'd certainly look at the Marxist Internet Archive, and there's quite a lot of material on there, a lot of contemporary material. I've also suggested a number of books which, you know, are quite frankly not from a Marxist background, but they do contain, you know, a degree of factual information. So I'd certainly encourage comrades to read them. So I want to begin with perhaps some sort of clear, sort of definitions about fascism and Nazism. And as comrades are aware, over the last few years, with the development of Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, developments in Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on, the idea of fascism is once more, you know, very much to the fore. And I think we need to begin with some sort of fairly clear definitions. And I think that I will begin with a definition which draws a lot from a contemporary writer who both studied fascism and Nazism, and also attempted to analyze why the workers' movement was unable to successfully combat it. And that, of course, is Leon Trotsky. Now, Trotsky defines fascism both in ideological and in organizational terms, but he defines a number of characteristics, and these are particularly well laid out in two of his books, The Struggle Against Fascism in Germany and Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. That's a sort of edited collection of various articles and so on at various stages. But he says that it's a movement that launches physical force, primarily directed against the organized working class, and that it organizes itself in counter-revolutionary fighting squads that are distinctly separate from the state, and that it's these fighting squads that give fascism a very different character from other counter-revolutionary movements, that these are often and frequently drawn from the petty bourgeoisie and sections of the more the unemployed and the more lumpenized sections of the population, that this movement often develops autonomously from the capitalist class, but objectively it acts in the interests of the capitalist class. It also has characteristics which are Bonapartist and in a sense draw on earlier movements. Trotsky in his writings, along with others, makes some reference to similar sorts of movements from the time of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in the 1840s and 50s in France in the late 19th century, but also in other parts of Europe, in Austria and so on. And that these movements then are directed against the working class, that they have this autonomous character, but they grow into a sizable movement during a period of capitalist crisis, and that particularly those classes which are disoriented, which are ruined by the capitalist crisis, the petty bourgeoisie, that these classes then form the sort of human material, the human dust, in the words of Trotsky. But also that when fascism takes state power, it then in a sense takes on a very different character. And that different character I will look at in a subsequent session on the nature of Nazism in the period 1933 to 39. Nazism in that period then becomes bureaucratized. It in a sense becomes integrated into the state. The upper echelons of the movement become part of the ruling class, and the lower echelons, the petty bourgeoisie, either integrated into the state or in many cases are dispensed with altogether. So I think that analysis moves away from the sort of ideas of the psychology. It also makes fascism a product of particular historical period, of particular contingent circumstances. So it's not, for example, simply the product of a special German way, a German exceptionalism. In Germany, both in the 1930s, but in later years, there was a lot of debate about whether fascism was, in a sense, or Nazism was uniquely German. This idea of the German exceptionalism, Sonderweg, a sort of idea that particular factors in Germany, cultural, religious, historical, had in a sense led towards this. There are also arguments that fascism is the product of a particular type of psychology. People in the Frankfurt school of sort of new leftism in the 50s and 60s argued about authoritarian personalities. And we can go off into all sorts of directions. Tina referred to Adolf Hitler's thwarted artistic ambitions, but we might also want to consider ideas of the role of particular churches, of particular cultural institutions, and so on. Now, I don't want to dismiss those factors as sort of contributing, but my main point is that Nazism, in the form that it took, was the product of a particular set of circumstances that emerged in Germany in the late 20s and 1930s. And those circumstances fed back to the failure of the German Revolution in 1918 and the type of capitalist and liberal democracy, bourgeois democracy, that emerged in Weimar Germany. So that's one particular emphasis I want to put. The other emphasis I want to put is one that again occurs in quite a lot of bourgeois history, and I think, you know, in many ways has percolated down into the British school system. I'm not familiar with other countries' education systems, but this idea that that Nazism is in a sense some sort of virus, some sort of germ, that it's always latent within us, that indeed that fascism and Nazism are all around, and that indeed there's potential for this sort of virus to sort of emerge again, in particular in periods of crisis. So that it goes from being the product of particular historical circumstances to becoming something of almost an ahistorical form. On the other side of that is also the argument, again, I think very popular, of almost the sort of demonic idea that Nazism and Hitler in particular is a sort of form of demon, almost a sort of form of evil. And if we think about the way that the Nazi period, and in particular the Second World War and the extermination of the Jewish population in Europe, all of these explanations then start to move into this sort of realm. So I think we need to be very careful, and we need to look at a number of specific factors and a number of specific causes. We also need to consider, and I will touch on this, but I'm sure this will come out in the discussion, the other theme as to why the Nazis were able to gain power. And I think there are two sets of factors there. One, of course, is the nature of the German labor movement's resistance to Nazism, the divisions and disagreements about the nature of Nazism, but in particular, the tactical mistakes and indeed the strategic mistakes, the nature of the German SPD, the main working class party, and of course, the analysis of the German communists, very powerful and very important movement, who in many ways misunderstood the nature of fascism, and indeed took, I think, really a very wrong line in how they should deal with fascism, and perhaps more importantly, in their relationship to the SPD and indeed to bourgeois democracy. The failure of the failure of the so-called third periodism, the failure of the development of a united front, and above all, the complete inability to realize the relationship between the Nazis and indeed capitalism, I think are very important factors that we need to consider. The other area that I want to stress as well is the role of the bourgeoisie and the role of the state in the Nazis coming to power. Again, in terms of quite well-established bourgeois history, the Nazis are seen as, in the sense of having overthrown the bourgeois democracy of the Weimar Republic. And if we look very closely at the circumstances from 1928, particularly from 1930 into 1933, we see that it's the bourgeois parties who have an absolutely key role in facilitating the Nazis' rise to power. That it's the capitalist class who see the Nazis as a force that they can use against both the working class and the labor movement. And that this idea of smashing the labor movement, of atomizing the working class movement, is absolutely crucial. Now, of course, bourgeois historians, play this down. They talk about one or two ambitious politicians like Schleicher or von Papen. They talk about Hindenburg's senility. They talk about the role of his son Paul, and so on. But what they really are very reluctant to do, and indeed have been very successful in doing, is to avoid the responsibility of capitalism for the Nazi regime. And indeed, the idea that the Nazis are, in a sense, a revolutionary force that sweeps aside the German establishment is one that's been very powerfully entertained. And of course, that's very convenient because it lets them off the hook. And what it does is then to throw the blame for Nazism, as it were, onto the mass of the German population, who in a sense allow themselves to be beguiled and to be led by the nose into the horrors that are going to come. So those are some of the areas I think we need to consider, and which I hope will draw out. But of course, in the relatively short time that I have, I can't look at those in great detail. So comrades, let's really take the starting point, which is the nature of Germany in the 1920s. Comrades have been in other sessions in this series, as well as earlier sessions, will be aware of the nature of the German Revolution, and that revolution in 1918 is a mass movement that overthrows the Kaiserreich. It overthrows the old imperial order and replaces it with the Weimar Republic. But of course, that replacement isn't just a simple transfer. It represents a defeat for the German working class, and that Weimar Republic comes into existence as a product of essentially the counter-revolutionary activities of the main German workers' movement, the SPD. And indeed, this new regime, the Weimar Republic, which rests upon the SPD, comes into existence through the deaths, the murder, the counter-revolutionary activities, the murders of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in particular, but in essentially a partnership between the SPD and sections of the old order, the Commander-in-Chief Groener, people like this. So essentially, this new republic is, in a sense, tainted from the beginning. It's a product of a failed revolution, and indeed, the SPD are in many ways its mainstays. So the early years of the 1920s, a period of some instability, of revolutionary challenges, of attempts to overthrow that republic from the left, numerous revolutionary movements, the growth of the German Communist Party, the KPD, but also the growth of the far right. And that far right, from the very beginning, is intimately connected with the state. Adolf Hitler is just one of a number of opportunistic far-right politicians who are closely connected to the German army. I'm sure comrades are aware of Hitler's membership of the German army, his role in working with the German army as a counter-revolutionary force in the period 1918 to around about 1920-21. So the Nazis have intimate links with they're just one of a series of movements which the old order, embodied in the Reichswehr, will use against any possible revolution. So this, I think, is quite a key point, this very early connection between the established order and the Nazis. Now, we know that Hitler's first attempt at power was in 1923, the so-called Beer Hall Putsch, which in some ways has a bit of a comic opera character about it. But it is actually quite a serious movement. And above all, it shows the connections between those sections of the German far right and the existing state order, particularly in Bavaria. The other key area I want to sort of stress is that Nazism as an ideology does have, I think, quite deep and significant historical roots, which go back into the 19th century. Again, the German words National and Sozialist, combining what are apparently two contradictory ideas, but are actually two contradictory ideas of nationalism and socialism. This this type of ideology has developed in the late 19th century in parts of Germany, but also in some of the border areas between Germany, or rather the German populations of Europe, the modern day Czech Republic, into Bohemia, Moravia, in Austria, Hungary, and so on. And this type of racism, this type of racist nationalism, does have something of a popular base, and it often is politically significant. It's particularly significant in the Austrian Empire. There are two quite successful politicians in Vienna, von Schönerer and Karl von Lüge, who trade on this type of racism, this type of nationalism, this type of Völkisch ideology, which of course then is very intimately connected with anti-Semitism. Sometimes these ideologies also can contain elements of anti-capitalism. And of course, the identification of the Jewish population with capitalism, the identification of minorities with undermining the conditions of German workers. Now, all these ideas, form quite a mismatch. And for those of you that have read Mein Kampf, you'll understand what a mismatch it is. I have to say that one of the worst things that I ever had to do as a university student was to read that book and then answer questions on it. And I have to confess, it's not only is its racism appalling, but actually as a set of ideas, it's really very incoherent. But the whole point about this is that Nazism does draw on these themes. The other area where it draws from is actually the established ideologies of large parts of Wilhelmine Germany, the existing Kaiserreich order. So in terms of its foreign policy of expansion to the east, or of colonial empires, these ideas of Lebensraum, of living space, and of conquest, these are actually quite mainstream ideas in the Germany before 1914. And indeed, they're going to become important elements in the Germany during the war itself. Again, there's an extensive literature on the way that the policies of the Kaiserreich and the German bourgeoisie do find an echo in the foreign policy of the Nazis. So Nazism, in terms of its racism, in terms of its anti-Semitism, and indeed in terms of its broader policy, can in many senses be fitted into the mainstream of right-wing politics in that way. And I think that this is really very important. I think I've made this point before, that Hitler's ideas, although absolutely obnoxious and abhorrent, do fit in terms of the ideologies of imperialism, the ideas of racism, which are then used to justify colonial expansion. So the idea of Nazism as being abhorrent to capitalism and indeed to imperialism, of it being, in a sense, this demonic force that comes in, is, I think, a very clever phrase, a clever way that bourgeois historians have done to try and separate capitalism from Nazism. But I'm afraid the work of historians like Fritz Fischer in the 60s and 70s in looking at this, looking at the policies of the German bourgeoisie, really, really bring this to home. Now, the beer hall putsch is a failure. Hitler, as you know, ends up in prison. It's a fairly comfortable prison. Landsberg, pictures of him in his cell. It actually looks rather like a sort of, quite pleasant Bavarian pension, sort of nice little chalet hotel. They're all sitting around in a group, seem to have quite a pleasant time of things. And that reflects, I think, the attitude of aspects of the German state towards those people who were trying to overthrow the Weimar Republic. The discontents with the Weimar Republic from the right extended in many ways to the wider population. And indeed, the way that Germany was treated after the First World War, reparations, the loss of territory, the economic hardships, And above all, the great inflation of 1923 gave plenty of material for discontent with bourgeois society. So the Nazis, in a sense, trade on that and build on that. But it's really much later, in the late 1920s, that they become a significant force. And that, of course, is through the impact of the Great Depression, the development of mass unemployment in Germany, and then the general crisis that starts to develop in German society. Now, if we look at the election results that I've put on the education site, we can see very clearly a correlation between those patterns. That throughout the 20s, the Nazis are an insignificant and a fairly small force. They remain well organized. They have sympathizers, in various sections, but it's not really until 1930 that the Nazis start to take on any great strength in that way. So that we can see, for example, in 1928, before the crash itself, that the Nazis get 2.6% of the vote. But by September 1930, they've increased their vote to 18.3%. And what's also significant is the growth of the communist vote, and indeed the strength of the social democratic vote as well. Now, the Nazis drew their main strength not as we would often be told from, quote, the working class. The Nazis drew their main electoral strength primarily from the petty bourgeoisie, but also some sections of those workers who would, in the Marxist terminology, lumpenized workers, and indeed other groups of the population. If we look at an electoral map of Germany in these years, the areas which resist the Nazis really until the end are the great industrial working class centers in the Ruhr, in parts of central and eastern Germany, in Berlin. And indeed, it's in the small towns of Germany, it's in the areas where the middle class are at their strongest, and where the rural populations, where they gain the most votes. Indeed, it's actually in the northern areas, in areas like Schleswig-Holstein, and then over into East Prussia, that they pick up some of their first votes. And another significant point, again, it's significant in showing the nature of the type of base that they're developing, is that they don't develop, for example, a particularly strong electoral base in Bavaria or in parts of Western Germany where the Catholic Center Party, the Zentrum, still remains quite strong. So the rise of the Nazis as an electoral force emerges in precisely those sections of the population that have been most badly affected by unemployment, by mass unemployment, and indeed by the complete dislocation that the impact of reparations, of the earlier inflation, and of the pressure, partly as a result of the financial settlements that it has on the German economy. The other key area that I would stress as well is that in this period, the Nazis are developing an electoral base, but they're also developing their mass movement. And that mass movement is very clearly a street movement. It focuses on developing an electoral support, but it also builds up its armed squads, its stormtroopers, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, made up of former soldiers, unemployed, and it's this that constitutes their mass movement. And it's this that will become the battering ram that they will use to attack and to move against the working class movement. Now, this is where I think the particular characteristics of Germany are so important, because that mass movement does have many antecedents with the counter-revolutionary movements that developed after 1918. The so-called Freikorps, which were made up of right-wing soldiers, often with connections to the Reichswehr, these paramilitary groupings retain an existence all the way through the 1920s. But they are a way of mobilizing support and, above all, of physically attacking the working class movement. So that in the period 1918 to 23-24, there is in many senses a low-level civil war. When Hitler, for example, develops his movement in Munich in the period 1919 to 1923, there are street battles, indeed there are murders. There is, in a sense, a low-level civil war, and the working class defends itself. It counters the Nazis, and in turn, the Nazis fight back. And so you have that tradition, but you also have, I think, a very strong counter-revolutionary tradition on the right that is willing to use armed force in that way. The other elements towards the end of the 20s are, of course, the attempts by the Nazis, and indeed by their wider supporters on the right, to crush what is a growing communist movement, and indeed a wider labor movement. And I think that the physical activities of the Nazis, the street fighting, are very much directed at crushing that. Now, I began in my introduction to point to two sort of themes. One was the bourgeoisie and one was the labor movement. And I think what I'll do is to look at the labor movement now before really concluding with the role of the bourgeoisie in bringing the Nazis to power. One of the inheritances of the birth of the Weimar Republic, and it's not only justified, it's actually fully accurate, was that the communists regarded the SPD as an openly bourgeois party, as a counter-revolutionary force. Remember, as I've said, comrades, that leading Marxists, Luxemburg and Liebknecht, were murdered, and indeed the SPD was essentially the governing party of Weimar, and indeed it remained so into the period of 1930, albeit as part of a coalition in the latter period. So its commitment was to the bourgeois order. It not only when the crash occurred wanted to preserve the republic, but it did so at the expense of the working class. Now, the SPD was the mass party of German workers. It received most of the votes. It had a very large and powerful organization. And so an orientation towards that movement was absolutely crucial for the communists. Now, the communists had historical reasons for suspicion, but they also had, I suppose, developing in connection with the Stalinist, the growing Stalinization of German communism, they also began to, I think, make a fundamentally incorrect analysis of the nature of social democracy. And it's then that we start to get the arguments developing in the late 20s that social democracy isn't just a bourgeois workers' party, it's actually social fascism. And so, far from regarding the United Front, and particularly the idea of winning social democratic workers to a strategy of the United Front to counter Nazism, the Communist Party leadership regarded the SPD accurately in the case of the leadership, but I think increasingly in terms of its rank and file as potential enemies and indeed counter-revolutionaries. It also, I think, misunderstood the relationship between between social democracy and capitalism, and also the relationship or the potential relationship between Nazism and capitalism as well. Comrades, I'm sure, will be familiar with the argument that if the Nazis come to power, then their regime will be unstable, and that, you know, as the phrase goes, after Hitler, then us, that we will, you know, in a sense, our movement will grow, and that we will then sweep to power in a revolution. Now, that strategy of regarding the SPD as social fascists, of regarding the SPD in many ways as the main enemy, led to all sorts of tactical, bizarre, you know, tactical orientations. Comrades, again, I know I was at a meeting last night and comrades referred to it, but there were instances where the KPD allied with the Nazis, for example, in the transport strike in Berlin. And there were other examples where many people understood Nazism to, you know, to be a movement that could potentially move to the left. The nature of Strasserism, the nature of the Sturmabteilung, all of these encourage many people to believe that this was inherently a movement that could take on a different direction. But much of this sectarianism and this left sectarianism was, I think, governed by the nature of the experience of German communists and the nature of the Weimar Republic. But it was also very clearly linked in to the Stalinization in the Soviet Union. And of course, that would then develop into popular frontism in the middle 1930s, which you know, we will look at another time in another session. So, if the strategy of the communists was in many senses sectarian, the strategy of the SPD was very much what you would expect from bourgeois Democrats. They were committed to to upholding the Weimar Republic, and their focus was on bourgeois legality. They didn't, for example, believe that the Nazis could come to power, and that if they did, or if they were to be resisted, then the way would be purely through bourgeois legality. A good example is in 1932, when von Papen's government, I'll look at him in a moment, but suspended the government of Prussia, which was the largest German state, which the SPD controlled. And then when in effect, Germany was being ruled by a form of Bonapartist rule by decree, they didn't see that as a potential threat. They simply appealed to legality and to, in a sense, playing by the bourgeois rules, and rolled over. So in that way, their failure, the failure of that leadership, it's you know, clearly its lack of revolutionary direction was a really serious weakness of that movement. Now, I've referred to the failures of the labor movement, and that's not to deny the heroism and indeed the you know, the combativity of sections of the German working class. When we're talking here about the street battles, we're not talking about, you know, punch-ups, the odd window being broken. We're talking about deaths, the incidents in Altena near Hamburg, good example of that. I think 19 killed in a couple of days there. We're talking about quite serious street violence, and indeed quite a clear attempt by the Nazis to drive the labor movement from the streets, to take control of the streets, but to smash the organized working class. The other element I want to stress, and one that often, certainly in the bourgeois histories, is played down, and I really want to play up, is the relationship between the Nazis and the ruling class. Now, this period from 28, or particularly 1930 and 33, is in many ways a fairly complex period of negotiation. And again, looking at the election results, you'll get an idea of the sort of electoral roller coaster the way that the Nazis, become the largest party in July 1932. Their rise in between 28 and 30, and then 32, and then of course their slide down in November 1932 before gaining state power confirming state power in March 1933. Now, the Nazis increasingly start to move in terms of their upper echelon towards clear links with the ruling class. These links, have been charted. Hitler's famous speech at the Industry Club in Düsseldorf, good example of this, where Hitler reassures the German capitalists that despite some of the radical rhetoric of the stormtroopers, some of the sort of left ideology of people like Strasser, the Strasser brothers, that in fact he is a perfectly safe pair of hands. He's a fairly acceptable pro-capitalist politician. Now they need some convincing of that, and indeed Hitler himself often has to balance within his Nazi movement. There are various internal revolts inside the movement when they think he's making far too many concessions to the ruling class. Not only does he have to remove the Strasser brothers, he'll kill one of them, certainly. I think it's Otto in 1934, but there's also Stennes and others who are removed. And so he has to sort of juggle between, in a sense, his left and the capitalist class. He also has to do the same thing with the army, who are afraid that the stormtroopers wish to become the new basis of a German army. So he's tacking, in a sense, between his own mass base and his new friends that he's trying to build support for. Now, one of the reasons why he can do this is that if we look very closely at the electoral results, we'll see that from 1930, particularly from 1932, there isn't a stable government in Germany. And indeed, a series of chancellors are drawn often from the center party, the Zentrum, but also from non-party governments, are essentially ruling by decree. So normal bourgeois politics of party systems have, in a sense, broken down. And that means that the rule by decree starts to replace the norms of bourgeois democracy. So that, in a sense, people like von Papen and Schleicher and Brüning are preparing the way. And of course, in these series of detailed political maneuvers, they see Hitler very much as the ingenue, the newcomer, someone that they can manipulate. Indeed, von Papen said famously when Hitler was appointed to government in a government in which the Nazis were a minority, he assured his friends, "Don't worry, we've hired him." In other words, that Hitler would be simply used by these figures to restore order, and then some form of probably monarchical semi-dictatorship would be developed. But of course, in this period, particularly in the very tangled negotiations in the autumn of 1932 and the winter of January or so 1933, Hitler plays a fairly clever game of holding back, knowing that he has the votes, but perhaps more importantly, knowing that the crisis is now really building. Because of course, given the levels of unemployment, given the levels of social dislocation, the mass movements of both the communists, but also of the Nazis themselves, are now vying for power. They're now, in a very serious contestation in this way. So you can see, I think, that we have here both a set of politics at the top the manipulations of capitalist politicians who see the Nazis as a means of smashing the labor movement, of restoring order and stability. And then we have the pressure from below, particularly from the working class movement, that is desperate both to counter the Nazis, but also to counter the capitalist crisis. Now, I will really end just very briefly now, rather gone on a bit longer than I intended. But my key point is that what actually assists Hitler into power as such is not simply his votes in the Reichstag. Remember that the vote had fallen. It's also not that he obtains, a great majority of the German population. Again, when you add up the figures, you can see that he does not have a voting majority, and that indeed the main industrial working class areas are still returning communist and socialist deputies to the Reichstag. So in that sense, we have to explain, I think, the assumption into power of the Nazis purely and simply in the role of the capitalist class who see Hitler and see his movement as a means of smashing the working class, of dealing with the crisis that German capitalism is facing. And that, of course, means that we have to understand the nature of that crisis, and in particular, the social group from which the Nazis draw the greatest strength. And I think if you look at some of the sections from Trotsky that I've pulled out there, his focus on the nature of the petty bourgeoisie, the way that that class is swinging to and fro, that in some senses it lacks an independent basis of its own, that is drawn to the working class, that in other ways it's drawn towards capitalism, that is the class that the Nazis draw upon. And that is the class that the working class movement must also try to win over to its side. And that can be done if that labor movement has a determined program to establish hegemony and indeed to complete the socialist project. But as I've explained, the SPD is committed to the maintenance of bourgeois order. The KPD sectarianism, I think, prevents it developing that sort of movement. And so we can see in many ways the tragedy of the German Revolution. Now, those tactical errors, in fact, they're absolutely grievous errors, and really we can see that the terrible impact that will have when the Nazis come to power and establish their state. But that does not let off, I think, the role of German capitalism, and indeed of capitalism in general. That this is not a demonic movement that somehow fools everybody. The German ruling class invite Hitler into power. They see him and they see his movement as a means of smashing the working class. And of course, if we don't link Nazism and fascism to capitalism, and we don't clearly make the point that those are our enemies, then of course we will find ourselves making the usual liberal criticisms, and indeed falling for the illusion that in some senses Germany is sort of fundamentally for the German culture, the German history leads to that movement. There are particular historical circumstances in Germany that give Nazism its character. That's obviously very important. But in any capitalist society in which the working class presents a revolutionary challenge, then we can see the ruling class using the autonomous forces of fascism and indeed, using it to smash the working class and to unleash the horrors that we were to see in Germany and the rest of Europe in the 30s and 40s. So thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very thorough, very, very good. Thank you very much for that. I was gonna, I'm coming in quickly. Nothing much to add on your exceptional outline of the failure of the left in particular, etc. A comrade has asked a question, James McGardle, can you shed some light on why parts of Germany felt like they got such a sour deal after World War I? is there any credence to this? And I think it's something you didn't mention, though I had to pop out briefly, is the Contract of Versailles. Basically, it's after World War I. Played a huge role in the impoverishment of impoverishing Germany to a massive degree. It was totally deindustrialized. So they took, I haven't even had time to look it up, but dozens, hundreds of factories were taken and actually, taken to France and the other Allied powers, or smashed up. There was a huge effort to stop Germany becoming an industrial nation again, and it was thoroughly smashed to pieces, the industrial strength of Germany, because it was, of course, a threat to the rest of Europe. It remained a threat industrially, which is, of course, what the First World War was about, how to divide up the world, and Germany became a rising power and had nowhere to go, etc. We've looked at that previously. So that the Contract of Versailles played a huge role in that, impoverishing the working class. In fact, so much so that after World War II, which again was lost by Germany, as comrades know, there were talks by the Allied powers to not repeat that, to consciously avoid that, because of what it helped to create, the total destruction of Germany and what it led to. So what they did is the Marshall Plan was exactly the opposite. It was trying to, while stopping the German army from rearming, etc., it made every effort to keep Germany or make Germany actually into a very well-off country. And it pumped money into Germany rather than taking it all out, as they did after the First World War. And it helped to set up the German banking system, etc. It was all remade after the Second World War, and it made Germany into very, very well-off country. Helped with the boom, the boom in the 1950s and 60s in Germany. First person who wanted to speak from the floor is Jerry.
Okay, thank you. I was very pleased with that speech. My first question to Kevin is, why don't you call yourself a Trotskyist? From the content of that speech, a few observations. Back in early 1923, Karl Radek made the infamous Schlageter speech, during the course of which he went so far as to say that we revolutionaries of the left salute you revolutionaries of the right. Basically, in your fight against the impositions after the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, as such. And by the way, and then of course the importance of the Strasserites. Oh, by the way, it was Gregor Strasser, Strasser that was executed in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Otto escaped, in fact, and of course he was executed along with Ernst Röhm, the leader of the Brown Shirts, because of course they were no longer necessary now that Hitler had the control of the state. I do think perhaps you underestimated the appalling effect of the third period Stalinism. The third period Stalinism was imposed by Stalin himself on the German Communist Party, and at that stage, such had been the purges that Thalheimer boasted that he did everything that Stalin asked him. He said they basically do our thinking for us. So there was no question of an independent revolutionary movement led by the Communist Party in Germany. They did exactly what Stalin requested. Stalin in 28 initiated the third period, and he initiated the third period basically from his conditions within the Soviet Union itself. What had happened, his defeat of the left opposition, and then he's turned against the right opposition during that period. So this ultra leftism that he developed was a killer blow to the prospects of the German Revolution. It absolutely wiped it out, because the two sections of the German working class, first of all, the section that was led by the Communist Party, which tended to be younger workers, unemployed workers, in fact, the most revolutionary section of the workers, they were now pitted against the older, more conservative, more aristocracy of labor section of the German working class, that were disappointed by the failures of 1918 and 1919 and 1923, the crushing of those revolutions, and had become quite conservative actually, but were actually key to the winning of a revolution in Germany, unless you could win the older workers by united front action. And the united front action had to be specifically united front. It wasn't the bogus united front from below, which the Stalinists requested. It had to be a genuine united front where you put demands on the leadership rather than saying they were social fascists. You had to acknowledge them as the leaders of the working class, the conservative leaders of the working class, in fact, the counter-revolutionary leaders of the working class, but in fact, the leaders of the working class as encountered, and you had to put demands on them. And the demands that you put on them had to be that you engage in joint action to defeat the fascists. But as Kevin has pointed out, instead of doing that, the social democracy was the main enemy, and they engaged in joint action with the fascists against the social democracy in the Bavaria referendum, and as Kevin has cited, in the Berlin transit strike in November of 1932, just a few months before Hitler came to power himself in January of 1933. Already they had no differentiation between the mortal threat of fascism itself and who was the main enemy, and as he has referred to, of course, the idiotic stance of after the Nazis, us, they will be exposed, and once they are exposed, we will become the new leaders. In fact, they kept saying it until they ended up in the concentration camps themselves, and then embarrassingly they had to stop saying that because they were no longer going to be able to do that. That's the basic thing I have to say. I was very pleased with the speech, and I thought it was very good. But I would put more emphasis on the counter-revolutionary character of Stalinism in that period, and how it achieved that counter-revolution, and of course that the Popular Front that developed from 1934, 1935 from the Seventh Congress was in fact only the other side of the same coin. But nevertheless, the sort of ultra-leftism at the time still had a certain feature of leftism to it, in that it sought to mobilize the working class. And in some places, like in the rank and file bus workers movement in Britain at the time, it did mobilize for a period the working class. Of course, the Popular Front was entirely opposed to such mobilization. Okay, thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jerry. Kevin, do you want to have a couple more people? Yeah, okay. I was going to say that Matthew Jones has asked, or he has to go now, so he put his point in the chat as well, similar to perhaps what Jerry was saying, who was very insulting towards you. Don't take it personally, you're not a Trotskyist. Only joking. But he's saying, I think we should understand that Stalin and Stalinism are essential for the rise of fascism in Germany. Without Stalin, Hitler would probably not have come to power. So it would be interesting for you to comment on that. Steve O'Neill is asking, did the third period coincide with the Nazi-Soviet pact? And he's asked in the Q&A another question, the role of the German lumpen proletariat. But I think he says then, you probably answered that, and they populated the SA. Okay. Sorry, I'm bringing in Tony now, and then you can reply. Tony, you look very strange. Have you got something done to your face?
About that. Oh yeah, I've got too much sun cream on me.
Okay. Look like you've had some. Okay.
I
No.
literally plastered
Tony,
it.
I thought it was war paint.
It could be. So you better be careful. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed your talk, and I didn't have any major disagreements. So really, I've just got some random observations. Really, firstly, the third period from 1928 onwards, which was it was imposed by the Soviet Union and Stalin. I have no doubt that actually, in the mind of Stalin and those around him, they actually wanted, in many ways, Hitler to come to power. They certainly had no objection to Hitler coming to power, because they saw that he would divide the Western powers, who, of course, wanted what they saw as the Bolshevik Revolution completely eradicated. And that, of course, led on to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was 1939, September, I think it was 1939, whereas the third period was 11 years before it. But I wanted to comment on the question, how the Nazi period is interpreted now by the bourgeoisie, because it plays a very large part in Western imperialist ideology. I mean, Zionism, Israel, uses the lessons that it draws from the Holocaust in order to justify its own settler colonial project. And likewise, the Western powers, I mean, draw certain conclusions from the Nazi period and leave out a lot of other things at the same time, such as the fact that both Churchill, Lloyd George, and the Western bourgeoisie welcomed Hitler to power as a means of defeating the German working class. They had no real objection to Hitler until he threatened their own interests. And we know what happened with the Munich Pact in Czechoslovakia, and then the invasion of Poland, where Britain and France declared war. But the key lesson the bourgeoisie wants us to draw is that Nazism, in essence, was about anti-Semitism and the Jews. It wasn't about the working class at all. In fact, I used to teach German students, teaching English as a foreign language, and almost without exception, when I asked who voted for the Nazis, it was the poor and the working class. Not the petty bourgeois or the bourgeois or the peasantry, etc. It was the poor who voted because they believed Hitler would end unemployment. So it's a complete rewrite of the whole period leading up to that. Whereas, in fact, of course, the working class parties gained, I think, in November 32, over 13 million votes compared to the Nazis' 11 million. It was precisely that decline in Nazi vote from July 1932, which led the bourgeoisie to put, the military and the industrialists to allow Hitler into power. And as you say correctly, the bourgeoisie thought that they could control Hitler once he was in power, but they were sadly mistaken. about that. But I just wanted to touch on the question of anti-Semitism, because Zionist historians, people like Lucy Davidovitz, Yehuda Bar, and others, argue that it was a war against the Jews. The prime target of the Nazi party was the Jews. It wasn't the working class or the left. And this is profoundly mistaken. In fact, between 1930 and 33, there was virtually no mention of the Jews. Anti-Semitism was not respectable then. It was waning in Germany. It wasn't increasing. There's the myth that Germany during the Weimar Republic was incredibly anti-Semitic. That's simply not true. Anti-Semitism was on the wane. It wasn't on the rise. And say even the Nazi Party really abandoned it. And in fact, even after 33, the majority of the Nazi Party wasn't particularly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism was confined to what you call the old fighters, the people who had brawled in the Munich beer halls with Hitler, the old fighters, as they were called. But anti-Semitism was not, it was not vehement. It was, of course, moderate anti-Semitism in the Nazi Party, but the kind of genocidal, obsessive anti-Semitism was confined to a relatively small section. But the role of anti-Semitism in the Nazi Party was as a kind of integrative ideology. It was the glue that bound, if you like, the left of the Nazi Party to the bourgeois Nazis in the Nazi Party. So it played a very important ideological and political function. And anti-Semitism, in a sense, was the kind of anti-capitalism of the Nazi Party. The Jews were the capitalists. So you didn't need to struggle against the real capitalists. All you need to do was eradicate the Jews, because they personified capitalism. Of course, we saw what happened with that. But I think that's important to understand. And throughout the Nazi period, I mean, you had a number of films, Judd Suisse was one, there was one on Rothschilds, and there were others, which were not particularly well attended. I mean, it's clear that even, although, I mean, Hitler became probably supported by a majority of German people as his rule developed, and that he was seen to be victorious over various things, whether it was the Anschluss or the invasion of Czechoslovakia or the recovery of the Rhine and the Saar plebiscite, etc. Anti-Semitism in itself was never key and integral. And it's very interesting to look at the anti-Nazi opposition as well, which you didn't cover. I mean, there is a whole, I mean, there's a book which I reviewed on my blog, Anti-Nazi Germans, by Steve Cushing and Marilyn Moose, which I do recommend to people. And there was certainly a very strong youth rebellion against the Nazi Party, the Edelweiss Pirates in particular, young working class German kids who hated the Hitler Youth. I mean, they saw them as the representatives of the staid middle class, as it were. And in working class areas of Hamburg, Cologne, and elsewhere, I mean, it was a sport to actually beat up members of the Hitler Youth who strayed into the suburbs. And they took to arms as well. I mean, it was quite serious, and they had a shootout with the Gestapo in Cologne. I think it was 1943, where the head of the Gestapo in Cologne was killed, and Himmler instructed them to clamp down on them, which they did. They arrested a whole number, and 13 of them were publicly hanged in Cologne. But this was a youth cult. They based around things like a love of swing music, jazz, another counterculture. So I mean, there was a German opposition, despite of course the very, very severe repression. Really a couple of other things after the war. I mean, the European Union really developed out of this need to ensure that Germany wouldn't rearm and then go on a war path itself. And the first institution which prefigured the EU was the Iron and Steel Coal Community, whereby France and Germany pooled the steel and the coal in order precisely that it couldn't be used for warlike purposes again. So one of the lessons of the Hitler period, and the bourgeoisie certainly drew a very negative conclusion, was the need for European unity, and thus was born the European Union. I don't really have too much to say, except denazification, of course, was again the policy of the Allies, but it was more verbal than in practice, because the Nazi judges who had executed thousands under Hitler continued in post up to the mid-60s, in fact. And their sentences and their judgments were considered legitimate. So under Konrad Adenauer, who had, I think it was Hans Globker as his closest advisor, who was responsible for drawing up the Nuremberg laws, there was never, in reality, a denazification. One of the reasons was because of the necessity of the Cold War. And Israel fell into that because it, in essence, did a deal with Adenauer, which was in return for reparations. Nothing would be said about the concentration of all Nazis in the new order in Germany. So I'll leave it at that. But yes, it's an incredibly interesting topic.
Fascinating stuff, Tony. Thank you. I'm not even sure Kevin mentioned the word Jewish people in his introduction.
Oh, I know.
No, but it's interesting, isn't it? You normally, when you talk about Nazism, that's all people talk about. So it's it's good you brought it up. Okay, Kevin, you want to come in now?
Yeah. Yes, Tina, I better be careful, because maybe the Labour Party will more evidence that I'm anti-Semitic.
They might expel.
Yeah. I haven't really got much to add to what the comrades have said. I think I think Jerry's made some important points there about the relationship between events in the situation of the KPD and Stalinism. The only thing I would add is that I think that there is a degree of sectarianism towards SPD workers. I think it's quite justified, the hostility towards the leadership. And I think that maybe the third period built on that, the German communists in the 20s have, went through some quite somersaults on a variety of issues. Your point about Karl Radek is well made. And in particular, the idea that that sections of the left Nazis, so-called the Strasserites, could simply be detached. Incidentally, Schleicher made the same mistake. He believed that Gregor Strasser could be detached from the Nazis and could be used to vote for his coalition government in that way. The other important point I would make on the third period, and I think Tony did touch on it, was that the third period does date from the late 20s, and I think it was Steve O'Neill who asked the question. And the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact is August 1939. I think it's about the 29th of August. So it's clearly very different. But where I do think it does fit in is with some aspects of Soviet foreign policy, and in particular the ideas that Germany and the USSR were, quote, revisionist powers, that they both had interests in destabilizing Versailles, and therefore could, in a sense, form a form of cooperation together. The Treaty of Rapallo in 1922, and in particular the foreign policy of Stresemann under Weimar, before the Nazis came to power, is part of that strategy. If anybody's interested, although it is a drama as opposed to historically accurate, there is a drama. It's in German but has subtitles, called Babylon Berlin, which looks at this period, and there are one or two references to connections between the Soviet Union under Stalin and the German bourgeois state, the Weimar state, before before the Nazis come to power in that way. So I think that there's already that sort of tendency, in particular, the idea that the German ruling class is discontented with what had happened to it at Versailles, which Tina outlined very well. The key point about Versailles, again, in relation to, I think, James McArdle's question, was that Germany didn't only lose land, it lost about a third of its territory and so on. It lost its army, or its army was limited to 100,000 soldiers and so on. But actually the reparations payments imposed really heavy burdens on the population. I mean, it was like a collective fine. And then on top of that, when the crisis hit in the late 20s, there were various plans to try and restructure it, the Dawes and the Young plans, but they still insisted on payments, which again led to financial ruin. So it was really quite a major problem. You know, it was a serious problem, an attack upon German capitalism, but of course the working class paid for it. And so when Jerry talks about the Schlageter speech and talks about Radek, you know, he's right in the sense that some communists believe that in a way playing up to the sort of national resentments could be a way of winning over German workers. And I think that points to the very serious impact that Versailles had. And as Tony said, and indeed Tina said, after 1945, although Germany was absolutely in ruins, the reparations were not imposed in the same way. Indeed, it's always a bit of a sore point with certain people in Greece that Greece was dealt with very harshly during the recent Euro crisis, and that added to some sort of tensions between the German ruling class and sections of the Greek political class. I think Tony made some excellent points. The nature of the anti-Nazi resistance I didn't deal with, because of course that will come later. But I've always been a tremendous admirer of those movements. When I first read about them in the 1980s, particularly the so-called swing movements, I never looked at Glenn Miller in the same way again. And it's interesting, the bravery of those people, and indeed a novel which appeared in English recently, or within the last 4 or 5 years, by Hans Fallada, Alone in Berlin, captures some of that idea of the everyday resistance. We've got some very interesting Gestapo reports. They're rather similar to the mass observation that was carried out in Britain during the late 30s and into the Second World War. And those sort of, paint a picture of a German population that is far from enthusiastic about the war and about, the Nazi regime. And again, we get a very different picture of, millions of people who are sort of completely brainwashed in that way. Now, the Nazis themselves recognize that they've got, a potential opposition, potential discontent. And you can see this by, pardon me, their consumer policies in the Second World War were designed to keep up morale in a way that in Britain, was not done. Just on a very minor point, consumer goods, particularly alcohol and various foodstuffs, and of course makeup and fashionable clothes, were actually more available. Don't say they're widely available, they were more available in Nazi Germany because of this, uncertainty about the reaction of the population. My reason for failing to mention the so-called Jewish question was exactly for the reasons that Tony said, and that although there were a hard core of Älter Kämpfer who were anti-Semites, the main propaganda of the Nazis was about national awakening. and about, you know, the Volksgemeinschaft, about rebuilding the national community. And it was pretty clearly based on economic and social demands. It was not explicitly and clearly racial and anti-Semitic in the way that we might think. And indeed, if you look at Nazi propaganda, it's only in the later periods, and particularly in periods of crisis, that the anti-Semitism is developed. There is a very extensive debate, which I can't really deal with here, about whether the extermination of the Jews, in terms of the way it developed, you know, industrialized mass murder, was something that the Nazis had planned, or whether it simply emerged through a process of radicalization and opportunism. And I don't really want to be drawn into that debate. I mean, I'm willing to have it, but I think what's more important is that what Hitler offered to the petty bourgeoisie and those sections of the unemployed that he managed to draw towards him was actually work. It wasn't directed simply at the Jewish population. Some of the older studies, there's one which I think must be now about 40 years old, by William Sheridan Allen, and it's about a mythical, it's not mythical, it's actually a town in Lower Saxony. And he did a study, it's called The Nazi Seizure of Power, and he talked about how the Nazis developed and took over this small town. And there were a couple of interesting things in the study. First of all, that there was virtually no Jewish population in the town, and the Nazis' main appeal was to attack Marxism. But of course, by Marxism, the people of this particular place in Lower Saxony thought of it as the SPD, because there was an SPD branch there, but not a communist branch. And what Allen makes the point is that the Nazi seizure of power, as it were, was very much a coalition with the existing sort of political notables in that town. And he sees the way that, for example, the police chief, the local judges, the mayor, and so on and so forth, all cooperate and indeed move over to work with the Nazis from 1932 onwards in that way. Just one last point on the sort of presentation of this period. In the last few years, there has been, I think, a very open attempt at revisionism. And it began initially in Germany with a number of historians who tried to make some sort of equivalence between Stalinism and Nazism. And in doing that, they were trying to say, well, actually, the Nazis weren't that bad, or indeed that Hitler had taken his murderous policies and extermination from the Stalinist experience. But perhaps more importantly, it was trying to sort of, in a sense, relativize Nazism and trying, in a sense, to shift the blame, particularly onto sections of the population who supported the Nazis, and those sections were the working class. And this identification of the working class and Nazism, and indeed of arguing almost uniformly that it was large numbers of workers who voted for the Nazis, you know, this has been, I think, a very powerful thing. Like Tony, I taught this period. I taught it in schools from the late 1970s, and all the textbooks talked about the working class supporting the Nazis. And it was that made me go and get original sources and, you know, and actually show them to my pupils and my students. And, you know, even just looking at a map of Germany and showing where the Nazis won support. You know, their first major land that they gained support in was Schleswig-Holstein, which is one of the most rural areas of Germany. And, you know, the Ruhr and Berlin. Berlin was hopeless for them. I mean, they never got more than 25% of the vote in Berlin in a free election. And indeed, even in March 1933, which was about the most unfree election that there possibly is, the communists still got 4 million votes. And so that shows that the working class, solid sections of the working class, still remain determined against Nazism. Anyway, I'll leave it now and take it out to another round of questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Cheryl, I cannot make you into a panelist for some reason, but I'm allowing you to talk now, if that's okay. You can talk without us seeing you, if that's okay. Sorry, Cheryl, don't know why that is. Do you want to ask your question, Cheryl? Or maybe that hand up was not on purpose. Okay. Well, Cheryl, if you can hear me and want to speak, maybe put it in the chat or something, yeah? Okay, next person is then Barry, please. Hiya.
I just wanted to ask Kevin about how significant the notion that the German state and the German army, because of the Versailles Treaty, were an anti-Western force, and cooperation between the leaders of the Soviet state and the German army and the German state contributed to the tragedy. The influence of the idea that the German army and the German state was some kind of anti-Western force and could aid the Soviet Union, the Soviet state, and the national interest of the Soviet state, I think took hold in the Comintern before the rise of Stalinism, before the third period and all the rest of it. So we had Radak, didn't we, with his national Bolshevism. But the elements of the Comintern certainly were thinking about the right in Germany and the German state and the German army as some kind of allies to help the interests of the Soviet state. You had the Rapallo Treaty, a conventional secret treaty, the kind of treaty that in 1917 the Bolsheviks said they'd put an end to. It had secret provisions, and it was cooperation between the German army and the Soviet state, where the German army was training in the Soviet Union, and I think it received armaments as well from the Russian state. So, and then there was, I think, there was also, I think we know that Hitler was, Hitler's regime, Stalin was the first to recognize Hitler's regime. And throughout the 20s, I think there was economic cooperation between the Soviet state and the German military and the German state, as far as I know. And that, I think, continued, didn't it? And so to many people, the Nazi-Soviet pact didn't come as an entire surprise. So I'm just wondering how significant you think those opinions were, and how big a role did national interests, not the international interests of the working class, the national interests of the Soviet state play in this role, play a role in the tragedy of allowing the fascists to come to power without any kind of struggle certainly from the German Communist Party. You talked about mistakes, but you just wonder whether it was all quite cynical by Stalin. That he was just concerned about national power games, and he had illusions that he could use the German army and the German state to his interests, to the interests of the oligarchy that ran the Soviet Union. And I know there's been a lot of talk earlier about the third period, about Stalinism and so on. But a lot of these developments took place before the establishment of Stalinism. And the final question I wanted to ask you is, how significant was it that Trotsky had a brilliant analysis of fascism? I agree with you absolutely that his definition of fascism, I agree with that. Brilliant insight and analysis, pioneering work on fascism. But when it came to the practical politics, just like in the Soviet Union, he had illusions in the Stalinist apparatus, both in the Soviet Union and in Germany. He thought they could be won back to the banner of Leninism, thought they were revolutionaries, or he thought there was a core there that could support working class interests, just like in the Soviet Union. And so he was totally opposed, as he was in the Soviet Union, of course, in Germany, to constructing a socialist or a communist alternative to the Stalinist party or the Communist Party that had been taken over by the Stalinist apparatus. Now, what that meant in practice, as anyone can see from his debates with other communists and socialists in Germany, he totally opposed any attempt to build a separate party, clinging onto the idea that the German party could be saved for revolution, which was a total and utter and fundamental mistake. So I'm just wondering, there were other aspects, of course, because sometimes he wouldn't unite with people who disagreed with his view of the Soviet Union, for instance. But I'm just wondering how significant these weaknesses within the Comintern and the developments that took place in the Soviet Union well before the rise and establishment of Stalinism in 1929, 1933.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Steve Freeman, please.
Okay, mute myself. Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for an excellent talk, and not really in disagreements with anything you've said so far, or even the comments that other comrades have made. And I guess just to comment on Barry's point, I guess maybe Trotsky was seeing a difference between the leadership of the KPD and the rank and file communists, the working class on the streets, as it were. Maybe he thought, since that was the mass party of the time, maybe the rank and file communists could be worth talking to, even if the communist party leadership was totally corrupted. But I mean, I don't know the details of that. My question was a slightly different one, Kevin, which was this: just going back to the Weimar Republic, I think is quite important in this story. So it was the product of a failed democratic revolution, and although it had a republican form and a republican constitution, its inner essence was kind of monarchical in some ways. You know, you could see the president having all the powers of a king, and Hindenburg obviously had, who was the president at the time, he was using those powers. And so this apparently democratic state had an inner authoritarian kind of ism, that the army, the police, and all these other institutions were still all standing. And as I think you said at one point in the talk, there were points where bourgeois democracy was almost abolished. I think you possibly said Prussia. I can't remember exactly what you said, but maybe in parts of Prussia, they just suspended it and carried on without it, and so on and so forth. Now, so this Weimar Republic was discredited in many ways for the reasons that it had to deliver reparations and Versailles, and it had to extract surplus from the German people. Therefore, it was also discredited in many eyes, which of course Hitler did a lot of stuff around. You know, that was one of his big themes. So when you come to the late 1920s and early 30s, you've got this crisis of capitalism that you talked about, a global crisis of capitalism and the impact that it had. But you've also got this crisis of a Weimar Republic. We didn't really have a crisis of our the British state in the same way, but it clearly was that the Weimar Republic was in a terrible crisis, and it was a crisis of democracy. And obviously Hitler and the state was one way out. To impose a dictatorship on Germany was one answer to the crisis. Just get rid of them. If democracy ain't working, get rid of it. You know, that was the idea. But was there, so then you go back to the question of, well, what's the alternative? Are we just defending the Weimar Republic at this point? Is our job as communists say we're defending the Weimar Republic against Hitler? Or are we saying, no, we've got to do something about the Weimar Republic? So it goes back to the program. We talked about a united front, the need for this united front of the working class. What would that unite? What would the policy or program of that united front be about? And that's a big question. I don't expect you to have the answer to that necessarily, but just to pose it, what would that be? Obviously, unity against the fascists when they're organizing on the streets, we can take that as given, and they were doing that. You know, communist and social democratic workers would be fighting the fascists on the streets, but it's got to be something more than that. It's got to say something about the state. What is he going to say about the Weimar Republic, since Hitler was attacking that? What, you know, it seemed to me you had to have some sort of program that could unite communists and social democratic workers, obviously against the fascists, but what else had to be said about the Weimar Republic? So I'm kind of asking the question about what was the program of what should have been, or what could have been the program of the United Front. And again, I pose it as a question that I don't necessarily expect you to answer it, but just to have your thoughts on it. You know, it's a bigger question than that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Ed Bober, and then Jerry has another short question.
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, all good.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kevin, and all the comrades who've contributed. I've learned a huge amount from this discussion. I want to sort of touch on this thing about, you know, Trotsky. We can see in hindsight now the movement of the German working class failed. And one of the comrades said that, you know, Stalinism didn't really kind of get hold until the very late 1920s. But even at the time of the 1923 revolution in Germany, where there was a huge opportunity for the German working class to take power, I mean, just absolutely with no reference to the Communist Party or any other party, the German workers just came out on general strike all over the country and took control of the factories. And then Lenin was around, but Lenin was already ill. And communists from Germany went to Russia to kind of get advice about tactics. And I think even at that point, the beginning of Stalin's influence with Lenin being ill was that those representatives of the German communist movement who were seeking tactical advice got hesitation and vacillation from the leadership in Russia, rather than go for it. This is your opportunity to take power. The course of history could have been very, very different from the summer of 1923 onwards, and it was already the beginning of the influence of Stalin, who never understood the strategy and tactics of the working class coming to power. My question to Kevin is, I mean, all the way through the Weimar Republic, the working class was still intact. It was still active in its organizations, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. And even into the 1930s, it had the tactics been correct, would it not have been possible for the Socialist Party and the Communist Party to work together, even after 1932, to actually bring down the regime. But as I think it was Steve Freeman, the last speaker, said, what is the alternative? If you're just defending the Weimar Republic, then of course there's no program around which you can unify the majority of the population. But if you have a revolutionary program that you're actually going to create a workers' democracy in Russia, then there would be something around which a kind of revival of working class unity could have brought about a completely different result. So you know, those it's kind of it's some observations and some questions really that maybe comrades could elaborate on if there's time. Thanks very much.
Hi. Thank you. Okay, Jerry, please.
Okay, I very much agree with Ed here and his questions. The defense of the Weimar Republic, of course, you're not defending the bourgeois state as such. What you are defending is the democratic rights that workers have under a bourgeois democracy, as opposed to the no democratic rights you have under the coming fascist regime. That's what you're defending. As to Barry, well, this is a long-running debate between me and him on Facebook. Did Leninism lead to Stalinism? Well, in my view, definitely no. Stalinism was the complete opposite of Leninism. You have to have a dictatorship of the proletariat under a worker state to suppress the capitalist class. You cannot just go from a socialist revolution to a socialist state, because that's not going to happen automatically. So I think that the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky did whatever they could do, giving the demise of the Soviets because of the disappointment and the defeats under that period. I think if anybody seriously reads Trotsky's Lessons of October, they will understand this point. So my view certainly is that the revolutionary integrity of both Lenin and Trotsky is not in question. Stalinism and Stalin had no personal revolutionary integrity whatsoever, certainly not after 1924, as Ed has pointed out. 1928, when he achieved the hegemony of the bureaucracy, and of course after 1934 with the assassination of Kirov, when he achieved his personal dictatorship. Thank you.
Oops, sorry, I had to run for the kids there. Okay, thank you, Kevin, and please to sum up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, comrades, for questions and contributions. I think one thing that's come out of the discussion is that we certainly don't take the Nazi seizure of power, which wasn't really a seizure of power, but was an ushering into power with the aid of the ruling class. We don't really take it as, you know, inevitable. And what we've all been trying to do is to look at strategy, tactics, and maybe also to look at a number of other underlying factors that may well have contributed to that. In reference to Barry's question, I think that the German army indeed was in a sense the core of the state that remained behind after the end of the Kaiserreich. And as Steve Freeman made the point, the use of Article 48, the rule by decree, And indeed, the role of the president under the Weimar Constitution was in many ways monarchical. And of course, in the case of von Hindenburg, who was, the former leading commander, he was then, intimately connected with the army, and so that nexus of power still remained. I think also that there were sections of communists, not just I think in Germany or in the Soviet Union, who did have arguments about that sort of trend that you referred to there in terms of national Bolshevism. And I think this is where the sort of strategies of attempting to consolidate the USSR, sometimes through diplomatic and other maneuvers, which had really begun, I suppose, in 1918, that can be fitted into that. But I don't think that that's the dominant view in terms of an argument that the German right or the German army could be the basis of some sort of revolutionary movement in that way. I think that it was an attempt to sort of gain concessions, very similar to the type of concessions in the NEP, and indeed also very similar to the type of deals that the NEP ushered in with sections of capitalist industry in that way. But I think that the tactics of German communists, I think, were clearly distinct from that. But I think we would need really to look at more of the documentary evidence. And although a lot of the material was released in Germany, I think the material in Russian is not fully available. But I certainly think that it's an area to look at. On Trotsky's analysis of fascism and the illusions in the KPD, I think Steve made quite an important point. I think that the KPD rank and file, and indeed even sections of the middle leadership, were courageous fighters against Nazism, and I think that Trotsky didn't decide to break from the Third International, and indeed to establish separate groupings. And I think that was for the reasons that Steve suggested, that he still thought that it might be possible to reorientate that party, and indeed, simply to abandon it would have meant abandoning, quite wide sections of workers. There were small left groupings. Some of them were communist opposition groupings, and also some left groupings from the SPD. But again, Trotsky is always trying to get those groupings to orientate towards the mass of the working class movement in that way. I think also that the nature of what was happening in Stalinism wasn't clear, and I think that in many senses, one of the impressions you get, not only from Trotsky but from other people, was that they were in a sense, rushing to keep up with what was going on, and you can sort of sense that in the writings. As I say, the section on the Marxist Internet Archive, gives us quite a good view of that. On Steve's point about the nature of the Weimar Republic, well, in many ways, it wasn't just that the SPD had illusions in it, but also that they didn't understand, or chose not to understand, that the bourgeoisie had little attachment to it. And this again, I think, is where the historiography, certainly the conventional historiography of the period, tends to see the Nazis and the communists as enemies of the Republic, and to see the bourgeoisie in a sense as the upholders. There's a particular cult of Stresemann. I was in an exhibition in Berlin, I think 2018, and Stresemann was sort of idealized. Well, Stresemann was in many ways in his foreign policy, fairly revanchist, and indeed was quite instrumental in some of the attempts to strengthen the German army and indeed to undo the Versailles settlement. And that, of course, is that the German ruling class had very limited attachments to bourgeois democracy. And that, I suppose, is the key point, that for much establishment historiography, capitalist democracy is seen as normal, and these revolutionary forces sweep it away. Or if it's not that, but some irresponsible careerist politicians like von Papen or Schleicher attempt to play the system for their own benefit. We've got to look at the whole of the capitalist class and their attitude towards Weimar. And of course, the powerful sections of society, the army and big capital. Remember that their relationship to the Wilhelmine regime was very close. They were intimately part of that. If we look at the type of war socialism that developed, the role of big capital in that is quite important. So in many ways, establishment historiography sort of shifts the blame away from capitalism and blames either Nazism or the extremism, so-called, of communists and socialists in that way. Obviously, the program of the United Front would have had to include democratic demands, particularly as issues of democracy, particularly the suspension of the constitution, and indeed the suspension of democratic rights, and what was in many ways, a developing civil war in which all sorts of democratic rights were being undermined. So that would have been, I think, a key element, along with other demands, and particularly for demands for a workers' government, which again were being raised, which had been raised before in 1923, as Ed drew attention to in that way. There was, I think the early 1920s show that, in a sense, that the German working class had tremendous potential, and its combativity and its willingness to struggle was clearly there. But it also, I think, suffered from the real problems of the nature of its leadership, and indeed the ultra-left turns, or indeed the turns to the right, and of course the predominance of social democracy. And I keep on coming back to this, that when we talk about the betrayals of social democracy, we're not just talking about Labour governments that don't carry out progressive or socialist politics. We're talking about an SPD that derailed the revolution in 1918, and indeed worked hand in glove with the murderers of Luxembourg and Liebknecht, who ushered in not just the Weimar Republic, but ushered in reaction in its blackest form. And indeed, I suppose the point that's often made by people on the left is that the defeat of that revolution in 1918 and the failure of the other revolutionary movements, the price that the German working class paid for that, and the price that they paid for both the tactical and the strategic mistakes of Stalinism and the betrayals of social democracy, was in fact Nazism. So we, I think, in our analysis, have to constantly look at that, and in particular not in the sense to absolve the leaderships of those parties, but above all not to absolve the nature of capitalist politics, who are intimately concerned with the development of Nazism. Historical clarity, I think, is absolutely essential, and I hope that the points that comrades have made this evening will help in some way towards that. Anyway, comrades, I'll leave it there. My voice is starting to go, so thank you very much.
You've worked hard, comrade. Me too, running after kids while chairing. It was a very good session. Thank you very much, Kevin.